All right, hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Christian, and I just wanted to upload my series, one of my Shroud Wars debate series. So this is part one. It's going to be me debating Alan on the question of can we prove the Shroud is medieval? We're really looking at the dating of the Shroud and the evidences on that front. This was originally posted on the SNS website. So I've had to make some edits, but I just wanted to say I'm sorry about some of the technical glitches. There are some audio issues later on in the show, so yeah, you'll have to turn up your volume for that. But apart from that, enjoy the show. It was a great debate. Yeah, I hope you guys learned something. All right, take care. Well, hello and welcome to Skeptics and Seekers. This is a special episode that we have coming up for you guys because, first of all, I'm Dale, representing the Christian or Seeker side. And, of course, we have... Oh, wait, it's not David this week. Who do we have as the skeptic?
We have Alan.
Woohoo! And guess what? We finally have our special episode, round one of the Shroud Wars, as Tyler has called them. So yeah,
me and you, Dale, mano a mano.
There you go. Finally, a fair discussion. We got both sides. Alan, I'm excited to have Alan. He was kind enough to come on and give his take, which I know many of these skeptical listeners will definitely appreciate. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much, Alan, and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Excellent. So what we're going to be discussing today, we're focusing specifically on can we prove that the Shroud is medieval? And for this round, it's going to be Alan that's making the affirmative claim that yes, we can. And we're going to be discussing various evidences that he has. So the relevance of the dating. So if, this is my argument where if it is medieval, so what? And then we get into three evidences for how Alan proves it is medieval. So firstly, we have the Memorandum from 1389. Then Alan's going to be going into the Pilgrim's badge, or the Medallion argument. And then finally, we're going to finish off with the Carbon 14, the slam dunk, as Alan has called it. But just before, oh, sorry, go ahead, Alan.
No, I was just laughing. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Cool.
Perfect.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I promised Alan, before we get into the debate proper, or the discussion proper, I just wanted to turn it over to Alan to give sort of an introduction as to who he is and his involvement in the Shroud. So Alan, yeah, feel free to take it away and give a 5-minute intro or something like that.
Yeah, okay. Well, I have to say, when I was preparing for this show, I was looking at stuff all over the internet, and I came across a Gary Habermas video. And interestingly, Google gave me a list of other possible videos I might be interested in. One was Flat Earth Fully Explained. One was UFOs 50 Years of Denial. And the last one was Has Man Ever Set Foot on the Moon? Well, it seems to me that seems to be the way that the Shroud is viewed. Either it's the real deal, or it's a delusional fantasy. There are these two camps that are pretty far apart. But originally, this wasn't the case. So before the C14 studies that were done, there were a number of documentaries that were pretty much pushing the Shroud as being the real deal. And yeah, I was caught up in that. When I first saw a documentary on the Shroud, I was amazed, I was excited. I was a Christian at the time. It wasn't important for my faith because whether it was a icon or a real relic was irrelevant. But of course, it was really interesting. If only there was a piece of cloth that bore the image of a crucified man with realistic wounds, that was actually a photographical negative, and contained within it 3D encoding that would be totally beyond the capability of a medieval artist. At least that's the way it was presented. Additionally, we also had this idea that there was pollen on the shroud that proved conclusively that it must have been in Jerusalem. These are the things I can remember from that time. Obviously, there are more things that were included within the documentaries.
Do you mind just a quick note? Like when about was this that you saw the doc? Was it the 80s or 90s? Or?
I think it would be 70s, 80s.
Okay.
Obviously, before the C-14, so it would be probably early 80s then, I guess, wouldn't it? Something like that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, good.
Anyway, that was what the documentaries concluded. Of course, then we had the carbon-14 analysis, and well, that was pretty much sure. It was kind of like a bit of a disappointment. You kind of keen to actually see this thing as evidence of something unusual and spectacular that occurred, but there it was. I think at that time, although I was a Christian, I didn't have any problem with carbon-14 dating. That was what scientists were saying definitely occurred, and I accepted it. And well, I still do accept it. I don't think anything has changed there. So okay, so that's my intro.
So that's Alan, everyone. That's Alan in a nutshell, so to speak. So, I just wanted to give Alan sort of a brief intro. Obviously, through my Shroud series, people know about me and my stance and how I came to the Shroud. Interestingly enough, it was also through Gary Habermas who kind of introduced me to taking it seriously as well. I think what we'll do at this point is we'll get straight into it. So the first item that's up for debate, so this is going to be my unique take, and it's on the relevance of the dating. So on this is going to be the only one where I'm gonna try to initiate this one because it's my unique idea. So basically, try to remember in context what's happening. So the way I see it is that the skeptic in this case is making a claim, right? They're saying we can prove the Shroud is medieval, and the fact that it's medieval proves that it's a fake. It can't be a G-belief authenticating event for the truth of Christianity or a sign or a miracle. If people don't know my terminology, that Christianity is true. So as someone not advancing the claim, I'm perfectly able to go, okay, well, in the first place, I can question your evidence that it is medieval. But for the sake of argument, I'm just going to put on my skeptic's hat and let's pretend that you can prove that for a second. I want to challenge you on the second component of your argument, because this is a multi-component argument, right? There's at least those two elements, that the Shroud is medieval in the first place, and that given that it's medieval, that means it's a fake. It can't be used as miraculous proof for Christianity or something like that. So on this front, I'm questioning this, and I've tried to interact with reasons that skeptics might present in my series. I've dealt with at least about 5 of them. So if you remember from my series, the first one was the argument from implausibility. It's implausible that God would do a miracle or do a miracle in the medieval period versus in ancient times or something like that. And I've tried to address, well, no, I don't buy this reason either. God is perfectly able to do miracles at any point in history. I mean, certainly skeptics, whether they think it's a crock or not, they see the validity in trying to come up with modern miracle healings or that sort of thing, right? So I think I've defeated this argument. What about the argument from ad hocness? So this is because I came up with an ad hoc historical situation. Maybe Jeffrey was praying one day for a sign, and for one reason or another, God actually answered him with, poof, a miraculous Shroud image. And you can, well, this is ad hoc. Of course it is. I'm not suggesting this as a positive historical hypothesis. I'm just saying, look, this is an equal possibility. It could happen for any number of reasons. Now, here's one of the more substantial ones. Then there was 3, the argument from the lack of sufficient attachment. And this is where I've countered that with the picture or the painting, right? I have a painting of Jesus on my wall, made in 1985, let's say. If God wants to poof and turn that into a miraculous image, well, we know there's a sufficient attachment because there's a reasonable connection. I know that this picture is meant to portray Jesus, the Jesus of Christianity. And if that's coupled with a miraculous image, well, that's good enough to be a G-belief authenticating event. A chronological connection is not necessary. Then there's 4, the argument from contextual indicators. And this is what I think is going on with most skeptics like Sarah and that sort of thing. Well, it's a burial cloth. It's not just a picture. It's a burial cloth. This is why all Christians assume, well, it must have belonged to Jesus then. If it's got to be necessary because of this. But again, I think you need to hold your horses here. If this is your argument that you're trying to use, because it could be possible that God is using this. He knows in advance that people will make this false assumption. He's not lying to the people. They're falsely coming to their own assumptions. Why would God do that? Well, maybe that was the only way to preserve it. If he did a miraculous piece of Jesus toast or something, someone might have eaten it, or someone would have thrown it away in the garbage or something, and then it wouldn't have survived into the 20th century when we started learning all of these amazing features about it. And then finally, 5th is my personal bias. I'm biased. I'm accused of moving the goalposts or special pleading and that sort of thing. And no, I'm not. I've really thought this through. I mean, I haven't seen any reasons from skeptics. I'm hoping Alan will provide some, but I have yet to see even one reason prevented by a skeptic apart from just saying, oh, that's bias, or I don't buy it. Okay, great, but I want to hear your reasons for it. You're making a claim, and I've tried to help you out. I've come up with these reasons and tried to refute them, right? So I've sat down and thought about this, but am I just being double standards for the shroud? Like, I'm not coming up with this idea because of the shroud. I'm consistent here, and here's one example. So with the Quran, I studied numerical patterns in the Quran. All of these numerical patterns that are presented by Muslim apologists apply to the 1924 Egyptian version of the Arabic Quran. This is the one that 80% of the world's Muslims use today. It doesn't apply to the Yemeni Quran. That hasn't been studied. It doesn't apply to older manuscripts of the Quran. Certainly, we don't know if it applies to, quote unquote, the original Quran that existed in the time of Uthman or that sort of thing. But still, I'm willing to accept it because Allah, if that's real, if he's real, is able to do a miracle suited for the 20th century, given his Molinistic providence. And if there are these numerical patterns in the Quran and they are proven to be of a supernatural nature, I don't care if the Quran dates from 1924. It's sufficiently attached to Islam proper, to the truth of Islam. It would attest to the truth of Islam. So I'm not being inconsistent here. I'm consistent, and I've really thought through this. So yeah, with that, that'll be it, and I'll let Alan have his take.
Okay, right. Well, I'm trying to keep the things short and sweet here. I mean, you've got to admit that most Shroud supporters, Shroudies as I like to be called, won't know what you're talking about here.
Yeah, I will admit that.
This will be something that's important to you, but for virtually nobody else. So whether they're skeptic or not, probably listening to this program, they will not know what you're talking about.
Just to counter quickly on that, and sorry, I shouldn't be interrupting you at all, but true, fair enough, but it should be important to them. I mean, we have people that think of new things and new ideas. I'm sure Albert Einstein was going against the grain when he was overturning Newtonian physics with special relativity and that sort of thing, right? So yeah, that's it, and I'll shut up and let you say everything. So
okay, well, I'll briefly say that I'm not sure that you have thought it through in terms of the reality of it. So, for instance, in this particular situation, we have you suggesting that it just pops up in some way in front of the Desharnays. Well, how? I mean, you're saying that the image. Why would the Desharnays, at great expense, create a cloth 14.5 foot long and 3.5 foot wide that is not a burial cloth? We don't have burial cloths that look like that. It's completely unusual. So you can't say it's a burial cloth. Why would they even create it? It's like Mr. Desharnay finds this cloth in his attic, takes it out one day and spots an image on it. Oh, says Mr. Desharnay, we could put some blood-stained spots on that and convince people that it's actually the burial shroud of Christ. So, well, how do you imagine that God actually creates the cloth as well as the image?
Why not? It could be.
Sorry?
Oh, I was just saying it could be. I mean, if we're talking miracles here, the sky's the limit. I mean, he could have...
and therefore there's nothing I can say. I can't disagree with you on that, because you could be talking about unicorns or anything. Yeah, I mean, if a God exists and has the powers that he has, he could produce any of those sorts of things. There's nothing I can say to counter that, other than to observe that I've never seen a miracle. So I don't know why you would assume that miracles can occur. But I mean, that's a completely different subject. I think we should stay well away from. But yeah. I'm just stating that I just don't have a response really, other than how would it work in practice. Yeah, I mean, you would think that the Desharnays would go around telling everybody this thing just appeared out of nowhere. It was, what the heck is it?
So this is David, and I'm exercising producer's right to cut in.
Sure.
I invented the right. I don't. There's no book that says a producer has the right to cut in, but my microphone. I mean, my mic, my own button. So, producer's right.
I told you this wasn't going to be over in an hour.
So I'm actually not. I'm not cutting in to complain about the time. I am cutting in to ask you a question, Dale.
Sure.
So just as I asked Barry one question, I will ask you one question about the point that you are on right now, and then I will turn the mic back off. It is this. So this kind of God could have taken a fraud and made a miracle out of it. Type of argument, because God can make a miracle if he just wants to convince people, with a G-Believe authenticating event, he can do it out of literally whole cloth. The problem with this argument to me, and if I could get you to address it, in fact, I'll turn the mic off before you start addressing it, and so you can have a last word on it. If that's what God was trying to do, then why something like the Shroud, where we have another several hundred years of debate over its legitimacy? Because if what God wants to do is say, hey, I'm God, I'm here, then why not do it in a way that he knows will convince most people, as opposed to doing it in a way that will just create another 1,000 years of debate? Go ahead.
Right. So yeah, first, just before I address that, I wanted to point out that Alan is absolutely right on something here. That, yeah, I have an 11 premise argument. I'm just starting with premise 8 and assuming, premise 7 of my argument is that miracles are an equally possible or equally probable option. Obviously, that's built on a foundation of my other premises. Premise number 1 of which is that God exists. So, Alan, if you don't start with that assumption, then there is this issue of prior probability that could come into play in terms of taking away, these options that I'm bringing about. So Alan is correct to bring that up, but it's outside of the scope of my Shroud series. Now, as to David's question, oh shoot, don't forget it. What the heck did you ask me? Sorry. What, Alan? Do you remember what he asked? My mind went blank.
I'd switched off completely.
Okay.
Sorry,
that's okay. I've been not paying attention to your conversation also.
Okay, I remember it now. Yeah. Okay. So
I'm going to switch back off again.
So here's where I'm going to resort to my Molinistic defense. I'm just appealing that we don't know. There could be any number of reasons why that particular miracle had to occur at that particular time. Remember, God has got the overall perspective. His overall goal, or at least one of them, is to save as many souls as possible. For some reason, doing that miracle in the medieval period could result in more souls being saved. Now, it might not even be, we think, oh, well, we're here now, so his ends must have been totally realized, right? Like, it was obviously to have stirp. That was the end goal. Not necessarily. I mean, God's aims for this image might not even be realized until the year 2050 or the year 2250. So, yeah, we're not in a position to know or to rule out, let's say, the fact that it could be entirely possible that God would have done a miracle in the medieval ages. He wasn't taking a fraud necessarily and turning that into a miracle. I'm not sure what you mean there. Like, it's not like, I'm not suggesting that, oh, the shroud was painted and then God went poof or something like that. Although I wouldn't rule that out either. But I'm just saying it could be poof and the shroud totally comes into being out of thin air. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. That's my answer. Is, again, I'm reverting back to this Molinistic thing. We're not in a position to know why the heck God would do it this way, and because of that, you can't establish your claim that the dating is significant in terms of proving it's a fake. If we can prove it is a miracle, that's obviously the assumption, or a G-Belief authenticating event. So yeah, I hope that answers your question there, David.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, I mean, I could say that if you were going to have a real relic appear out of nowhere, why on earth would you choose the Middle Ages, where it's going to be surrounded by an infinite number of fakes? It just makes it look like a fake then, doesn't it? But I mean, I can't win this argument, because all you're just going to say is that, yeah, but like 300 years down the line, with the flapping of a butterfly wing, all of this comes out to you. I can't win this argument. It's not an argument I should even get involved with. It's a statement that you're making, Dale, which is fine. I suggest we go on to the next.
Yeah. No, I was just happy because I was sincerely interested to get a better idea of why you guys just aren't even considering this. And you're the first skeptic who's really gone into detail. That all the other ones just kind of. I hear what you're saying, but I don't buy it. Okay, great, but I want to hear your reasons for it, right? So yeah, it's absolutely correct what you say. You can't rebut this Molinistic defeater that I'm offering. That's why I see it as so good and universal. But under that same vein, that can explain why it's hidden, right? It's sort of the same problem as the hiddenness of God. Why isn't it?
But whenever you're bringing up magic, is what this is. We're not on the same planet. We're not even in the same universe. There's no way I can kind of discuss this. Anyway, I suggest we go on to the next, which is the memorandum. Is that?
Yep. So now moving on. Sorry, guys. Now we're going to get into so let's forget about this relevance of the dating. Now let's see if I can challenge, or if Alan can establish, is the shroud in fact medieval? And we have three different evidences, and we're going to do the first one. So this is the bishop memorandum of Bishop Darcis in 1389. So Alan will introduce that.
Okay, so the practice of faking holy relics was widespread, as I've just said, during the Middle Ages, and indeed the first documentary evidence we have that mentions the shroud is a very skeptical 1390 report from French Bishop Pierre Darcis to the then anti-Pope Clement VII, denouncing the shroud as a fraud. Apparently, the shroud was being used as a religious scam to fleece gullible believers, and the bishop was appalled that the shroud was bringing the church into disrepute. He informed Clement that the shroud had also been displayed by the Ducharny family in Liry about 35 years earlier, and his predecessor, the then Bishop of Troyes, Henri de Poitiers, had been suspicious of how such a major relic could suddenly appear in the hands of a French family, and inquired as to the origin of this remarkable artifact, and quickly discovered it was a fake. Briefly, I'm going to read an abridged version of the memorandum, this letter to the Pope, highlighting a few points.
That'll save me the trouble, so good.
Okay, right. So we're going to do that. Right. The case, Holy Father, stands thus. Sometime since in this diocese of Troyes, the dean of a certain collegiate church, to wit that of Liry, falsely and deceitfully, being consumed with a passion of avarice, and not from any motive of devotion, but only of gain, procured for his church a certain cloth, cunningly painted, upon which by a clever sleight of hand was depicted the twofold image of one man, that is to say, the back and front, he falsely declaring and pretending that this was the actual shroud in which our Saviour Jesus Christ was enfolded in the tomb, and upon which the whole likeness of the Saviour had remained thus imprinted, together with the wounds which he bore. The Lord Henri of Poitiers, of pious memory, then Bishop of Troyes, becoming aware of this, and urged by many prudent persons to take action, as indeed was his duty in the exercise of his ordinary jurisdiction, set himself earnestly to work to fathom the truth of this matter. For many theologians and otherwise persons declared that this could not be the real shroud of our Lord, having the Saviour's likeness thus imprinted upon it, since the Holy Gospel made no mention of any such imprint. While, if it had been true, it was quite unlikely that the holy evangelists would have omitted to record it, or that the fact should have remained hidden until the present time. Eventually, after diligent inquiry and examination, he discovered the fraud and how the said cloth had been cunningly painted, the truth being attested by the artist who had painted it, to wit, that it was a work of human skill and not miraculously wrought or bestowed. Accordingly, he began to institute formal proceedings against the said dean and his accomplices in order to root out this false persuasion. They, seeing their wickedness discovered, hid away the said cloth so that the ordinary could not find it, and they kept it hidden afterwards for 34 years or thereabouts, down to the present year. Now, this memorandum would have been written about 1389, and no doubt Dale will say that the actual letter itself was undated, so we can't be actually clear on the date of that.
Yeah.
Now, as it happened, Pope Clement the Seventh, who was actually an anti-pope, set up in opposition to Pope Urban the Sixth in Rome, was a relative of the Ducharny family, and so would be inclined to defend them against this charge of faking the shroud if it had no basis. Clearly, it did have a basis, however, so Clement instead ordered the Ducharnists to stop declaring the shroud to be the genuine article and to display it as a representation of the shroud of Jesus only. But he also granted indulgences to any pilgrims who went to see the representation. So his cash-strapped relatives still got the pilgrims' money they were seeking via their scam in the first place. It's clear that Darcis knows a lot about the Shroud. He knows it's not a traditional painting. He knows that it's being used to separate the religiously minded from their money, evidence to which we're going to come on to shortly with the medallion. Most important information we have, though, is that it is a fake. The Pope thinks it a fake. Darcis thinks it a fake. Henri de Poitiers thinks it a fake. It has no provenance. De Charny doesn't say where he got it. It just turns up in 1355. The de Charnys make no attempt at defending the allegations of it being fake or the canons of Liry. It was presented as a fake. It was treated as a fake. Liry is a tiny place in the middle of nowhere. That is not how relics of renown are treated. Note the gigantic chapel church that was built to house the crown of thorns. If it was considered to be a renowned relic, it would have been put in the middle of nowhere. They knew how to treat substantial relics in that particular day. So most of these things are centered around it being a fake. Indeed, last point here is that 100 years later, in 1449, there was a guy in Netherlands who'd actually seen the shroud and said, a certain sheet on which the shape of our Lord Jesus Christ has been skillfully painted with remarkable artistry, showing the outlines of all the limbs, and with the feet, hands, and sides stained with blood, as if they had recently suffered stigmata and wounds. So even 100 years later, this thing hadn't got off the ground, as it were. It hadn't actually appeared. It hadn't been discovered as being a substantial relic. What I could say is that, just an aside there on what that guy was saying, it does seem to suggest that the image was an awful lot more distinct then than it is now, because of the way that he described how clear the blood was. And it's true that the shroud is continuing to fade, and it's still fading even now while it's locked up in an airtight box filled with argon, which again seems to suggest that it couldn't possibly have lasted 2,000 years. Well, anyway, that's my main argument there. I can deal with the historicity bits now. Dale, or do you want to attack those?
Yeah, so if you're going where I think you're going, so basically just to start, before I lay out my case of why I think the memo is not persuasive evidence, I just wanted to throw it over quickly to Alan. So, within a few minutes or so, we have a comparison test, the Gospel of Mark. This was a document written 40 years or so after the events. It narrates that Jesus walked on water. It narrates that Jesus was crucified before Pontius Pilate and buried in a tomb. So, I just wanted to we have this historical document. Alan sort of mentioned him before in regards to the memo. He's like, well, look, it's right there in English. There's nothing in this memo that suggests the shroud isn't a fake. So I wanted to get Alan's take. Well, there's nothing in the Gospel of Mark that says Jesus didn't walk on water. So first of all, do you believe that the Gospel of Mark's accounts are literally true? If so, why or why not?
Well, no. Okay, so what we need to look at here is what historians would consider the ideal situation with regards to evidence from the past. Now, what I've done here is to get that list from Bart Ehrman, who has listed a number of points that we need to look at. So in an ideal situation, we would have sources that are firstly numerous, so that they can be compared to one another. The more, the better. Secondly, derived from a time near the event itself, so that they were less likely to have been based on hearsay or legend. Thirdly, were produced independently of one another, so that their authors were not in collusion. Fourthly, do not contradict one another, so that one or more of them is not necessarily in error. Fifthly, are internally consistent, so that they show a basic concern for reliability. And sixthly, are not biased towards the subject matter, so that they have not skewed their accounts to serve their own purposes. Right, so since he is a New Testament scholar, obviously those things are going to be something somewhat pertinent to the Gospel of Mark. Now, I have to say, I haven't actually gone away and found what Bart's view is, but what I have done is kind of come up with a table of those 6 wishes, and where I think the memo lies and where Mark lies. So briefly, so Mark, we don't know who wrote it. We only have copies of Mark. The first full Mark we have is centuries after the original. We can't be certain what was in the original, and we know that it has been corrupted, scribes adding material to it. Written 40 years after the events described, in another language, in another country and culture. There are no indications of any pre-Mark traditions within the text. Although Paul's writings come before Mark, there is very little commonality between them. Is Mark making the stories up, or are they based on some form of oral tradition? So with regards to some of the lists, all right, so numerous. How many are there? Well, when we're talking about the memo, no doubt Dale is going to be bringing out another letters that were written about this particular event. So there are, in fact, a number of pieces of information we have around this. With Mark, no, we don't have anything. Mark is the first gospel to be written, and at that time there wasn't anything else. So that it doesn't go derived from near events. Memo, definitely, absolutely right on the ball. The guy's writing as it happens. Mark, it's 40 years after, so no in the case of Mark. Independent sources, yes, with the case of the memorandum. We've got some people, various people, the Pope, etc., writing about this. So lots of different sources. With Mark, none at all. All we've got is Mark on its own. Do not contradict each other. The memo fails this. We have got contradiction. I think you could say it was a contradiction. Each person has got their own state. It isn't that anybody's contradicting anything Darcis is saying here directly. It's just that other people are saying other things which you might think are in conflict. So they both. I mean, it's probably, but that's not applicable to Mark. Are they internally consistent? Yes, absolutely. Makes everything that Darcis says makes perfect internal consistent sense. And of course, I think you could say that would also apply to Mark as well. I'd have to be a bit picky if I started to say it was no. Not biased towards subject matter, certainly not in the case of the memorandum. Darcis is definitely biased on his viewpoint, and definitely Mark is as well. So no. So Mark fails pretty much all of them except one, and the memo passes all 2. So that's it, really. So so when we're looking at some of the Gospels, you have to take into account how far away we are from the actual documents themselves, and remember that the Gospels that come after Mark are just copying Mark. So there isn't any agreement between them from that point of view, except Mark is agreeing with himself. Because, but I don't really want to go into too much detail on Mark. I'm just saying, in passing, if you're comparing these two different things, well, they are just chalk and cheese. So, over to you then, Dale.
So thank you, Alan. I appreciated that comparison because, the Gospel of Mark is comparable in the sense that it was written 40 years after the fact. Same with this memo. The events of when the shroud first came about is around the mid 1350s, 1355 to 1356, in about that range. And the events that he's referring to, the inquiry.
Some of the events that he's referring to, yes.
The main ones that I'm concerned with, put it that way, like the inquiry held by his predecessor, Henry de Portier, and I didn't say it as French as Alan did. Alan did a better job there with that. But these are occurring 40 years after the event. This memo was written 1389 or 1390. I take the 1389 as being the more probable date. Doesn't matter. Either way, it's about comparable to the Gospels. So I agree 100% with Alan's list of Bart Ehrman's criteria. I sort of phrased it into, okay, so we have three different tests that Christians can use that historians can use on a historical document. There's the bibliographical test. So Alan alluded to this. Do we have the original autograph? How many manuscripts do we have, and how early are they in relation to when the original was written? Alan also referred to the internal evidence test. So is there anything within the content of the document itself that that we can make some conclusions on? And finally, 3, the external evidence test. So are there any relevant historical circumstances or like bias or any external documents that are related to this matter? So this is how I'm going to be assessing this memo, just like I would any other historical document, including the Gospels, like the Gospel of Mark. So in the first place, with this document, taking the bibliographical and internal evidence tests combined. So what do we have? In the Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris, we possess 2 copies of this memorandum. They're labeled Folio 137 and Folio 138. As Alan alluded to, yes, I'm going to mention neither of them is signed, and neither of them is dated. One is complete, the other is incomplete. In terms of Folio 138, it is heavily edited. And it's marked out as a first draft with underlines where they're crossing out certain words or violent expressions. They have the Latin word vacat, which means take this out. And they're not even addressed to its intended recipient. So on that front, sort of externally, there's no record of this memo at all in the Vatican archives or the official records. That's problematic because we do have archived these other letters that I'm going to be referencing as well, and they're all signed and dated. So this is problematic in and of itself. It should raise doubts. We're not even sure if this memo was ever sent, let alone received by the Pope in the first place. So that's in terms of the bibliographical test and internal evidence test. Also, in terms of the actual Latin words, the translation that Alan read, we're not even, I didn't pay attention to this part, but there's certain words that we're not sure about the translation. For example, is Darcis saying that the artist that created the shroud confessed to having cunningly painted it? Or is it an artist, as though some artists in general said, oh yeah, that's painted, kind of thing. There is a question mark as to what the proper Latin translation is of those words. Also, we have no trace or mention of this memorandum found in the canon history of the. So we have access to the work of a collector and historian who, Nicholas Camusat, and he archived all of the Diocese of Troyes documents and history. This was in the early 1600s is when he did this. There's no mention of this inquiry, no mention of this memo. And this is despite the fact that he specifically mentions the Leary Church, Henry de Poitiers, and mentions that Henry approved of the activities of Geoffrey I. No. And also, we have the historian Nicholas Camusat, who wrote his book, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Prompterium Tricinian Diocesis. I'm not good with other languages or Latin, but so he kept detailed records of the ancient archives from the Diocese of Troyes. He wrote this history in the early 1600s, and he expressly wrote about the Leary Church, about Henry de Poitiers, and how, as he was the bishop, he approved of the activities of Geoffrey I. He records about Pierre d'Arcis specifically and his dispute with Geoffrey II on the Shroud. But yet, interestingly, there's a complete omission of the transcription of this memorandum. There's no mention of an inquiry that took place in the 1350s on the Shroud. It's just completely absent. So I think this is suspicious, and we know from history that there would be we would have every expectation for him to mention this if it was in the records. They weren't destroyed by the English in war. The city of Troyes was left untouched, even though the region itself was under attack at the time. There was no raging fire that destroyed their records or that sort of thing. So I think this is problematic. And lastly, in the internal evidence note, Bishop d'Arcis was a meticulous lawyer. We have other documents, as I've mentioned, from him, where he carefully cites documents and he quotes from these to support his cases. But funnily enough, with the memorandum, we get none of that. There are no documents from this inquiry that took place, alleged inquiry that took place. There's no quotes from Bishop Henry. And he's not even sure about the timing. Alan read it correctly, right? It's about 34 years or earlier. 34 years or thereabouts is the English translation. He should know the precise details. Again, there's no reason he would have had access to Bishop Henry's 40-year earlier investigation. He would have known the dating and that sort of thing, just like we have the precise dates with all the other letters and that sort of thing. So what about the external evidence test? So first I want to start with the historical circumstances quickly. So we know that Alan's admitted, so this is on the issue of bias. So Bishop d'Arcis did have a bias. Plus he has an established motive, because in Christmas of 1389, his church collapsed. The roof caved in, and a stained glass window fell down. This is very expensive. So I think in Bishop d'Arcis's memo, he's always castigating the Leary Church, saying, because of avarice, they were greedy. But my honest reading is I think there's a little bit of projection going on there. I think he saw how much money the Leary Church, which was separate as a collegiate church, it wasn't under the authority of him as the bishop. I think there's a little bit of projection going on there. But what else do we have? We also have historical documents that Alan's alluded to, and I'm going to cut this down. I'm just going to mention one specifically. We have a letter from Bishop Henry himself. This is signed and dated, and it's written to Geoffrey I de Charny, the original owner of the Turin Shroud, dated May 28th, 1356. And Geoffrey died 4 months later in September of that year. So in this letter, Henry doesn't mention an inquiry, doesn't mention the Shroud, doesn't mention a dispute with Geoffrey I at all. He's saying I'm totally satisfied with everything you're doing, and he gives his. I'm not going to read the Latin, but he says, "We praise, ratify, and approve of the goings on in the Leary Church." So yeah, there's no mention of an inquiry. Are you going to say it just everything all happened within 4 months before Jeffrey died? That sounds very ad hoc to me. I don't think that's plausible, and this makes it suspicious. The guy who Darcis is saying did the inquiry, in his own letter, has nothing but good things to say about the Leary Church and Geoffrey I de Charny. Now, there's a bunch of other documents, and I promised Alan I'm not going to go through each one of those, but it's basically a bunch of, between Darcis, the King of France, and the anti-Pope Clement VII. I just want to mention, again, in none of these, there is some waffling back and forth with the Pope where he says, okay, we'll call it a likeness or representation. And then he sort of, you can't get money, then he flips and says you can't get money. So it's obvious that the Pope is playing politics, I think. I don't think he knows conclusively either way. And certainly in none of these other 7 letters, there's no mention of an inquiry or an official inquiry or the memo itself being mentioned specifically. So yeah, I think we have a lot of reasons to think that we shouldn't believe this as historical evidence. We should be very skeptical of using this, and that's my take. And I'll turn it over to Alan just to give a short follow-up, and that will be the last word. I'll shut my mouth and we'll move on to the next topic.
So a promise.
Yep. Lovely.
Well, okay. Well, just a few points. I have to say this. I'm going to say special pleading. I have to say this. You don't know the motive of Darcis. We can't know that. I think I've hinted at before, there's a heck of a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes here that we don't know about, but are hinted at. And all we've got to go on are the actual letters. One of the things you said is that we don't have any evidence that the actual letter was sent. In other words, within the paper records, we don't have that.
Yeah.
Fine. Well, this is the Middle Ages. You won't have half the records I've done in the last year, let alone what would have occurred in the Middle Ages. And interestingly, one of the articles that you provided mentions that the Pope had received some kind of letter from potentially the Charnys, but we don't have any record of that either. so clearly, it doesn't mean anything that there are incomplete records on all sides. Also, given you've seen the size of this particular letter, and you'll see a full copy of it in the links. Darcis has gone to a great deal of trouble to actually create this thing, and he seems to be really pretty angry, and it is showing up. He's sticking his neck way out. Is saying to the Pope that he should do something about the de Charnys, who are family members of the Pope,
right.
And he's going to the King as well. And so, if anybody was to find out that this guy was lying, well, there could be major repercussions. So there are, there's the finger of truth, or the look of truth about, in my mind, about a lot of the things that he is saying. I don't think you can't wish it away. I'm afraid it's there. And in fact, even if it never even got sent, it wouldn't matter, because the points that are raised within it are establishing a date. And I think that most Shrouders are most concerned that he is saying that there was somebody that created the Shroud. But the most important thing about this thing is that the amount of people who think it's a fake, and with all fakes, they are all created by somebody. So you don't even need to say that this thing was created by somebody, because it is evident from what everybody says. It's evident from what the Pope says. So everybody's thinking that. It's just that that Darcis is verbalising it. So I don't think that's the takeaway. My takeaway from I think we're coming on to the Medallion next. So if we deal with that briefly, then I'll kind of finish off on my considerations on this. So what we're doing is we're establishing a date, which was approximately 34 years before 1389. So that's where we're getting to. We don't have any evidence of the shroud being referred to by any of the people that we've been talking about prior to that date.
Okay. So or if you're not done, I was just going to say. So I promised you the last word. I do have things to say, but I think people can find it in the sources. So I'll leave it up to you. Did you want me to respond, or do you want to move on?
No. I think we've got to move on.
Okay, cool. So I'll just say for the listeners, there are the things that Alan's raised are addressed in my sources. So look at that, and also look at Alan. Alan's provided his own sources as well. So I think that's great. Look at both of our sources and decide for yourself on that, because there are responses that I know of to some of the things Alan said there. So yeah, we'll move on to. So this is the second piece of evidence that Alan's hinted to. This is the one I personally think is the weakest. I don't think it's not even. So this is the Pilgrim badge, or there's this medallion, and I'm going to leave that to Alan to explain to us.
It's not proof really at all. It's just backing up what's been said previously in the Leary documents. So what's happened is that exactly as Darcis has said. The Shawnees are interested in making money by setting up the relic as a tourist attraction, and it's part of the Pilgrim. It's part of the pilgrim route that people go on, and they go to the Leary chapel, and they pay their money, and as a souvenir of one of those visits, they get a piece of metal which is about 5 inches by 6 inches, and it contains a front to back image of a head-to-head nude man, which is the shroud. It also has on it the family coat of arms of Charney and Divergy. Charney being the husband, and Divergy being his wife. So what we have here is something that is produced as a result of the setting up of the chapel and having the relic presented to the general public, as it were. Now, the medallion goes into, it is quite detailed. It has the herringbone weave on the cloth. It has the front and back images. So we have 2 images of a man, the front and the back on it, and we have the direct connection to Lurie, because we have the coat of arms of the Charneys. So it is very, very, very good evidence that what Darcis was saying was correct. They have set up to make money out of the shroud. Interestingly, somebody has said that because the Deshani. The Deshani's family coat of arms is on the left-hand side, that he was probably alive at the point at which this thing was cast.
Yeah, I'll be mentioning that, yeah. Okay.
It's a lemon. So it's probably, so we're talking about it being 1356, 57, it's going to be really early. There could be a question mark there, but it is there. So all the Medallion is doing, this is the first time we have an undisputed archaeological evidence of the Shroud at a particular point in time. Later on is going to be talking about others, but they are definitely disputed, and I will be disputing them.
Yeah.
But I think you're going to agree with me here that this is beyond dispute, that it's so connected to Neri that it has to be. I have to say there was another cast found actually in Liri.
Yeah.
So that kind of underlines it. There was an ongoing production of these badges going forward to make money.
Yeah. And so yeah, I guess my take, Alan's absolutely correct. So the first time this medallion was discovered in 1855, this medallion that he's talking, this pilgrim's badge that you would receive, was found in Paris under the Pont au Change bridge that crosses the Seine River there. And I would agree, although I'm going to be questioning it just for my own purposes quickly, but it bears an unmistakable reproduction of the Shroud. There's that naked body, front and back. Even the herringbone weave of the cloth is there as well. And it has both Geoffrey de Charny and Jean de Vergy, the coat of arms. So this is why we can get the date. So because they're both there, we know that it has to be, this medallion has to date from 1349, which is when they were married, to 1356, before Geoffrey died, because under the laws of heredity, they couldn't have the... there was the custom of the time. They couldn't forge the medallion with his coat of arms after he was dead. So it's got to be from when they were married in 1349 or sometime before September 19th, 1356. That's when these medallions would have been made. So yeah, that puts, this is definitely supporting evidence, it seems, but I don't think it goes as far as Alan wants. I mean, no one denies that the de Charny family was showing the Shroud and making money off of it. That's completely uncontroversial. No one denies that. So, but it doesn't support the controversial claims that there was this inquiry going on and that the artist confessed to having faked it and cunningly painted it. Or that sort of thing, and that's the controversial. And I don't care that, of course, they were showing the Shroud and making money in the 1350s. No one denies that. So here's my main argument. So this will be a quick one. And in the first place, I just wanted to ask Alan, and keep it short, like 2 minutes. How do you know? And I'm on your side. I agree. You're absolutely right. This is a depiction of the Shroud. But for the sake of argument, how do you know that this is a depiction of the Shroud as opposed to some random other relic or something?
Yeah, and it could be said that, I mean, if it wasn't for the coat of arms, you could assume it was representing a number of different things. You couldn't be absolutely certain. I mean, the herringbone pattern is helpful, it could be representing a completely different person, possibly not on a shroud at all. There's no way of knowing that for sure. So it's kind of an accumulation of all of the bits of evidence that are coming up with. I mean, but without the coat of arms, you could argue it, but you couldn't actually be absolutely certain of it. I'm pretty sure it's just you have to have quite a number of things.
And I think on that front, I think on that front you've done good to mention. So that in isolation, this evidence isn't convincing at all. I think you would agree with me on that. But it's being used as
something else that we haven't mentioned, and that is. Why wasn't there anything like the Leary medallion before that? Because it isn't as if you're trying to argue the point that the shroud was in existence prior to this point, why don't we have medallions going back a couple of centuries prior to that?
Here's the thing, though. Like David does this to me. I have points. Like I'm going in order, and like I give the first one, and then like David will, and this is fine. But I'm saying like you're raising my next point. Like I was gonna get there. I just didn't have a chance. I'm going in order, if that makes sense. But okay, so just before that's a fair point. I think you're right to raise that. But just before we get there, so what I was just going to say is that in isolation, this evidence isn't good enough, but you're using it in the full context of the memo, and this is supporting evidence. Is great. Okay, cool. So now on your great question. So here's my thing. So Alan makes the claim that this is the first depiction, and I think this is begging the question. It's not the case that you can prove this is the first depiction of the shroud. I think that's an assumption based on the memo and that sort of thing. You're taking that as valid evidence, and then you're reading that in here. Obviously I've mentioned things that I think might be depictions of the shroud, the Prey Codex or the Justinian coins from 692 AD. So I think we have to be careful about just going, it all adds up. This, therefore, is the first depiction, and that proves that the shroud is medieval. As to why wouldn't there be any medallions prior to this then? And I did address that in part 2, I think, where there's a gap in our knowledge, right? Because for a long time they were once the shroud was taken from Constantinople under the historical hypothesis, the speculative hypothesis, right? Like it was illegal to, both from the Pope and the King, to show and profit from relics that were stolen from Constantinople. So this is why we would expect them not to mention it. There's this gap in the record. They hide it and that sort of thing. And only once the historical circumstances were appropriate did they then start showing the shroud and making money. So that's sort of my explanation. It's historical speculation. It's certainly plausible, but I can't give definitive answers as though I know why did it vanish from those years from Constantinople until the 1350s when it was starting to be shown. That's my take, really.
Okay. And obviously you'll be talking a little bit more later on when you're considering all these other evidences, inverted commas, that you have for the shroud existing prior to this point.
Yeah.
So I think we can leave the memo at this point.
Yeah. Carbon 14, the big baby, the one that everyone's been waiting for, I think. So yeah. This is Alan's third, just for the audience. So Alan's third, and in my opinion, the strongest, and I think you would agree, he's quote unquote, this is the slam dunk case. This is what convinced him when he was pro-Shroud in the 80s. Once he heard about this, it was done. The shroud's a fake. So this is the 1988 carbon 14 dating, and I'll turn it over to Alan to present his case first.
Okay, I'm not going to go into the description of what carbon dating is, although in the links you'll see a few articles on carbon dating and how it works, etc. So do have a look at that. Mm-hmm. What I would say is that it's at the time at which the measurements were done on the shroud, radiocarbon accelerated the mass spectrometry was in its infancy.
Come on, Alan.
I'm falling apart now because
it's a Saturday morning.
So for 3 hours.
Yeah.
Notice, my speech is going all over the shop. So you're going to have to delete all of this. Yeah.
Well, it's up to David.
I need a drink. Right, so all right. So the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit is the only radiocarbon lab in the world that specialises in archaeological work, particularly the dating of bone. And over the past 2 decades, the ORAU has seen a boom in the number of samples coming into the lab, reflecting the increased use of radiocarbon dating in the archaeological context. In 2001, ORAU, the lab, had only dated approximately 10,000 samples since its inception. Now the lab dates about 2,500 samples every year. So this is the gold standard of dating things, less than 5,000 years old. I mean, it's radiocarbon dating, despite a number of shrouders trying to suggest that it doesn't actually work, most people do accept that it is an accurate way of dating things. So really, that's all I've got to say with regards to carbon dating, except that I think there is some question on the protocols that we needed to address, and I think that on Dale's side and other people have been asking about the way that they came with the protocols for the carbon dating. Now, originally, the protocol was to have 7 laboratories involved, not all of them AMS labs, to use a different method of carbon dating with different labs. The problem with the other type of carbon dating was it needed more material than the AMS type, but they did set it as 7. They also wanted 2 sample sites, not just one, and they wanted blind tests with the cloth. Now, this had been kind of agreed between the people that had come up with the protocol, and that would be the way that it is dealt with. And from 1978, from the point which Sturp had got in touch with Harry Gove, who was the guy that developed the AMS system, it took 10 years to get an agreement with the church on doing the actual C14 tests. And when it came to the end, the church disagreed with the findings of the group that had been set up, and decided to issue their views on this, and what they think ought to be done. And they specified that only 1 sample should be taken, and that the number of labs involved should be restricted from 7 to 3. Their rationale being that you're going to take one heck of a lot of the shroud and burn it, and we'd rather like to have it as a small amount as possible. So these decisions were taken.
Do you mind if I just quickly interrupt? Not to ask anything, right? But just to back up what Alan's saying here, he is absolutely correct. And what's funny, what's ironic, is they actually destroyed more of the shroud, the 75 milligrams more than would have been destroyed if they had stuck to the original plan. So it's ironic that they ended up destroying more out of concern to destroy less. But yeah, sorry, Alan, go.
Yeah, I know that when they cut, I'm not sure of that. I knew when they cut the actual sample size, they gave Arizona 2 lots of.
Yeah, there's still a sample. Yeah, out there.
Yeah, and actually they had some left over, which they later was able to go and test again, but not well on a C14 basis. But we'll come back to that a bit later.
Yeah.
So the 7 labs went to the Pope and argued their case, and they were just told that Turin was in charge, and so they were the ones that specified that. The choices of the labs was okay. I mean, they thought they were the best in the world, and probably were the best in the world. They decided to have just the British Museum to control it all. There were supposed to be 3 people controlling it, and again, there was nothing really wrong with that. I mean, the main problem, as we've seen afterwards, is the fact that they only chose one particular site. I mean, that's the reason 7 was an overkill anyway. The only reason they went for 7 labs was that if there was an outsider, anything that was outside the range of the rest, then they could easily just ignore that and go with the rest. Now, as it is, because the results were so close, they didn't need 7, as it turned out. But you have to assume that the one piece they took was representative of the whole cloth, which, given all of the other things that they were, the details they went into it to do that, seems reasonable. I mean, they had textile experts picking a piece of the cloth and to look out for any reweaves or any splicing in the new material, that the material was the same as the rest of the material on the cloth. So they did quite a bit of testing on that. So, I mean, there shouldn't be any major issues with regards to it. But also, not only did they produce data for the samples from the shroud, they also had 3 control samples as well that they knew the full provenance of. So not only did the individual labs have to agree with each other on the shroud, they also had to agree with each other on the other 3 samples and get the date right of the other 3 samples. So it was quite a bit of a test, really, for them to do, and they passed in flying colours. They did actually do that. So Harry Gove was, his particular lab was kicked out of the list of labs that he has a lab in Rochester, and that was kicked out. So his nose was out of joint from that. But he did actually go and see the tests being carried out in Arizona. So and he was impressed, and he knew right away that they nailed it. So anyway, so over to you, Dale. with your comeback on the negative side of this then.
Yeah, sure. And great job, Alan. I thought that I liked hearing your case. I think you did a good job there. And so just to start my case, so I'm going to try my best because I've got so much. I've got like 20 pages of notes on the carbon-14 alone. So I'm not going to be reading that. But yeah, so just to make this as quick as I can. So in the first place, I want you guys to remember Alan is the one making the claim. The way he's claiming that the Shroud is medieval. Okay, how do you know? Well, one of the ways we have this carbon-14 date. So I was happy with Alan's presentation because he didn't mention too much about attacking a neutron flux or the invisible reweave, of which I would have just said, you know what, great, I don't care. I can just say I don't know because I'm not making a claim. I'm just trying to establish that the carbon-14 dating, for whatever reason, we can't rely on them as with regards to the actual calendar age. So that's going to be my main goal here. So just a couple first notes, because I know Alan took issue with my presentation of Harry Gov in part 1, and I did want to back up. So here's one issue that I think Alan will agree with was problematic. The first one, Alan, you have Harry Gov's book, whether justified or not. I think you will at least agree that Harry Gov did. I portrayed him accurately. He hated Stirp, and he was largely responsible for having them removed from the process in 1988. Is that correct?
No, it isn't. No.
Oh, okay.
He, although he had his own views on Stirp, he thought they were a good line to the cardinal, because they had the contacts. So he didn't want to rock the boat too much there. No, it looks, certainly from his side, he's saying that the church, and obviously he's looking at it from the way he views the particular Stirp team, but he thinks that given what had been happening with Macron, the church thought they ought to distance themselves a little bit from Stirp. In fact, they distanced themselves from Stirp. They distanced themselves from Harry Gov. What they were doing is saying, no, we're the ones in charge here. We're the one calling the shots. You have to dance to our tune. So I think we're going a bit too far to suggest that he was actually the guy that got them kicked out. I don't think that's true.
Okay, well, I would just suggest, like his book's out there to read, because I do think it's true. Learning about some of the letter, some of the behind the scenes. Now, you're absolutely right. This isn't about attacking personalities. So, okay, so Alan disagrees. That's fine. I do think that he was instrumental. If it wasn't for him, Stirp would have been involved. Irrelevant, though, but here's the point that I wanted to raise. Stirp originally, even as Barry mentioned, had 25 other tests planned as part of this 1988 examination. The carbon-14 would have just been the 26th. And I gave that quote. Here's Harry Gov himself. I believed Stirp's members to be so convinced it was Christ's Shroud that I was determined to prevent their involvement in its carbon dating. If that were ever to come about, I feared the most important measurement that could be made on the Shroud would be rendered less credible by their participation. Fortunately, in this, I was successful. So here's one of the issues that angers me the most is he's preventing scientific progress. I mean, the more data, the better. These 25 scientific tests would have answered a lot of questions that we had from Stirp 1, including ones related to dating. They had 3 tests on the pollen. You like to talk, Max Frey did a lot of work on the pollen. I assume by the pollen you're talking about the stuff by Max Frey and not, sorry?
Yeah, I'm talking about the
not the more recent.
Which was not the Sturp one, it's the one prior to that.
Gotcha. So yeah.
73, is it?
Yeah. So they had follow-up research on that. That would have been definitely helpful. Or they were going to do research. Remember those Pontius Pilate coins? Right now, that's a Class 3 evidence. I wouldn't use it. Imagine if Sturp was able to get in there and do some more detailed testing to see, who knows what we would have found in regards to those coins. Also, they were planning on measuring the isotropic compositions of the cellulose. So that's helpful in distinguishing between European and Middle Eastern created fabrics. So yeah, the bottom line, not attacking personalities or anything like that, but would you at least agree, hey, the more data the better? It would have been great if these other tests were not prevented from being done.
Yeah, I guess. I think one of the things that you'll have noticed that Gov would have complained bitterly that they were wrecking the shroud by sticking gum all over it, firing X-rays and UV, and that perhaps some of that may have got to the ears of the church. Clearly, those things are not going to be perfectly. There's talk of Adler having to wash off the gum from the fibres with toluene in order to do the tests, and so that it's kind of like ironic that he didn't find any paint particles after he'd washed the fibres. Well, yeah, duh, but they were having to do that because they gummed up the works. You see, that's the thing. So there was some sort of question mark there as to whether or not they needed to do anything more than doing the C14 test, because that all on its own is a thing that's required to know whether it's a fake or not, which it was. Yeah, that was. It didn't need any other tests. Okay. And what other tests would have done with regards to? I mean, I don't see why on earth they couldn't do it.
I got a lot
after that date, once they'd already passed the C14 test. So I don't know what was going through the minds of, is it Ganella? It's Ganella, isn't it? Who's the science advisor to the Archbishop. Yeah. So what was said, I don't think we're party to, so we don't really know that. So yeah, you can complain about it, but I think it's a bit too far to point it to suggest that Harry Gove was the guy that was the evil guy behind it all. I think the bit that you were quoting there was where he'd just come in and had seen what these guys were like, and that was his assessment immediately. It actually dragged on for, as you know, I was saying, this thing dragged on for years and years and years before they made a kind of decision on it.
Okay. So
anyway.
So yeah. Again, so that quote actually comes later on. In the early days, you were right. He wanted to use Sturp because they had all the contacts. But from my reading of what went on, forget about the background. This is okay. So that's our personal opinions, and I don't want to. I want to focus on these substantive points. So that was the point, that these 25 other tests would have been better from a purely scientific standpoint. Now, getting into the carbon-14 then, we have to remember, so this AMS carbon-14 technology, in terms of the wider scientific community, Alan's alluded to that it's totally uncontroversial, everyone accepts it, it's case closed type deal, but that's not what I found from the research I was able to find, because we have to remember this was relatively new technology. It was just invented in the late 70s. I think 1977 is when Harry Gove was the co-inventor of the technique, and it was competing with other new carbon-14s. There was gas proportional, there was liquid scintillation, and then there was the accelerator mass spectrometry, which is what Harry Gov was the co-inventor of, and what was used specifically to date the shroud. So I just wanted to give in the first place, sort of a general take. I looked at various scientific and archaeological experts. They're secular. They don't have anything to do with the shroud for the most part. So yeah, for example, in New Scientist magazine, this is an article published in 1989. They did a detailed study. The study was done by the Britain's Science and Engineering Research Council. I mean, that's a credible body. And they compared the accuracy of 38 carbon-14 labs. Not all of these were AMS, but it included AMS in it. And they tested this using artifacts of known age. This was their final conclusion. Quote unquote, the margin of error with carbon-14 dating seems to be as much as 2 to 3 times as great as practitioners of the technique have claimed. Of the 38 labs investigated, only 7 produced results that were that the organizers of the trial considered to be satisfactory. Murdoch Baxter, who was kind of commenting on this particular study, he's the director of the Scottish University's Research and Reactor Centre at East Kilbride, and he basically said, look, related to because the carbon-14 scientists attributed any anomalies in the results to measurement error, as opposed to systematic error. They just assumed it's got to be measurement error. So he was saying this, well, look, it is now clear that other unaccounted for sources of error occur during the processing and analyzing of the samples. The AMS labs were way out, even when dating samples as little as 200 years old. Here's Dr. Robert Stuckenrath. He's one of the early pioneers and world's experts in carbon-14 dating specifically. And he was asked, so the context of this is nothing to do with the shroud, but he was asked in an interview to comment about the usefulness of carbon-14 in dating archaeological artifacts. And he says, well, look, the date of a sample whose provenance is in doubt is worse than useless. It's misleading. Now, I think that's an exaggeration. I don't take that literally, to be fair. Okay, what about an archaeologist? Here's a secular Middle Eastern archaeologist, someone that I'm going to be mentioning when I get to the direct contact hypothesis, Eugenia Natowski. So she is involved in the shroud under direct contact, but she says this: in any form of inquiry or scientific discipline, it is the weight of evidence that must be considered conclusive. In archaeology, if there are 10 lines of evidence, carbon-14 being one of them, and the carbon-14 conflicts with the other 9, there is little hesitation in secular archaeology to throw out the carbon-14 date as inaccurate due to unforeseen contamination. I'm getting to the end, but Science News. They also did an interview with several carbon-14 experts. This is just immediately prior to the 1988 carbon-14 dating test, and they were asking specifically these scientists, well, what do you think of the carbon-14? Is this going to solve all the problems? And here is their collective conclusion. So, quote unquote, grave concern that the AMS technology used to date the shroud is not yet ready for the task of dating the shroud, largely because of the proven spuriousness of the readings from small samples. And there has been very little testing of linen. So Alan mentioned that they were known for testing, at that time they were known for testing archaeological artifacts like bones or leather, I've seen, but there was very little to do with linen, the properties of linen at the time the test went on. So yeah, basically Dr. Garmin Harbottle was one of the scientists interviewed in Science News, and he mentioned, look, each substance has its own peculiarities when attempting to carbon date it, and I wish that linen cloth was better understood before the shroud is dated. And I promise, Alan, I'll let you speak when I finish off the Trondheim report. Okay.
Yeah.
So we have a 2004. This is a peer-reviewed science journal. It's secular. This is the Journal of Research of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they thoroughly investigated the carbon-14 dating and its relation to the shroud. So basically, I have a quote here from Dr. Lloyd A. Curry. He says this, quote unquote, "A wave of questioning has followed of possible artifacts that could have affected the carbon-14 result. The question of non-contemporaneous organic matter on the shroud from things like oil, wax, smoke, tallow, etc. Over the ages, the effects of such can be a very serious and complex matter in relation to the shroud. It is deserving of a new quantitative investigation for the impacts of possible impacts on measurement accuracy." So this is going to be my last point in general, but I have those three other arguments after you're done. But because I'm talking so much, when I finish the Trondheim, I'll give Alan a chance to come back. But then remember, I've got those three other arguments to go. Okay, so quickly. Also, the carbon-14 labs, originally there was 5. Before it was 7, it was first 5. So this is in 1983. The STURP scientists were still involved, and they were a little bit concerned because of the relative newness of the AMS technology, and they gave it a test. So they gave them 2 samples of known historical age at first, and all the labs got the first sample correct except for Tucson. Tucson seems to they messed up the age by half the known age. On the second sample, all 5 of the original labs got the dates wrong. They did a total of 11 experiments on these 2 samples. 6 out of the 11, all 5 of the original labs got the date wrong by more than half its known age. So Gov and them, they switched in a third sample to try and make up for this problem. And what were the results with the 3 samples combined? So a total of 7 out of 17 results came back with all 5 labs getting the date wrong again by half its historical known age, just like what happened with the shroud. So this is kind of an answer to Alan, because he was saying, well, if they got it wrong, why did they all get it wrong in the same way? Well, this proves that can happen if they're for various reasons, as I'll get into. So yeah, that's my take. I'll before I go into my 3 specific reasons as to why I think the carbon-14 in 1988 was wrong, I just want to turn it over to Alan for about carbon-14 in general. What do you make?
Okay, well, no. So let's go back to the 1988 test. So this is 10 years after it was first proposed to use C14. So they'd had actually got a bit of water under the bridge by the time they actually did do that test. When they did, they had an unprecedented number of samples that they used in this particular test, Sample 1 was from the shroud, sample 2 from linen from a Nubian tube of the 11th to 12th centuries. Sample 3 was linen from a mummy of the early 2nd century CE, and sample 4 was from threads removed from the cope of St. Louis d'Anjou, dated to 1290 to 1310. There is therefore no question that the shroud is not medieval. They got those things absolutely right. So not only did they agree, they agreed on the dates, and also the shroud came up with a date bang on the historical information that we have with regards to the memo that I've just read out. So everything that we had on that was a confirmation. Now, I've forgotten one of the things you said there, but the
Trondheim report?
With regards to, yeah. Well, so there's a couple of things. The first thing you said was in New Scientist. It was something that
a study of 38.
New Scientist is not a peer-reviewed journal.
Correct.
And one of the things that on Physics Forum it says, "Is New Scientist credible? I would not trust anything I read in New Scientist." So, right, in general, I'd never trust anything except peer-reviewed, Anyway, but...
Wait, that contradicts... You said you would never trust... Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, the other point is that with regards to... No, I'm not an expert on carbon 14 days. I'm just saying that with regards to contamination issues that you raised, there are... With carbon dating in general, there are issues that you have to take into account, and you've got to be able to clean the samples to remove as much as possible of any possible contamination that you have. Each of the labs use their own methods of cleaning in order to eliminate as much of that as possible. But the underlying thing is that with regards to the Shroud, we've only got 2 dates. We've got 1350 and we've got AD 30. And there is no amount of stuff gunk that you can have on the Shroud that is going to bring it from 1350 down to 30. Somebody was saying you would need twice the weight of the Shroud as pollution in order to be able to do that. Well, see, this is the problem. What you're trying to do is to throw question marks or create question marks to say that the whole thing doesn't work without realizing that even at its worst, it has to partially work, and there is no way that you can get to an AD 30 date. There isn't. So,
right.
And that's why all of the suggestions that have been made as to why the C14 dating could be incorrect have just been thrown out. Now, you will also know that the head of the Oxford lab, currently Chris Ramsey, has said clearly that he doesn't think there's anything wrong with the data. He had nothing to do with this. I think he was a student at the time the original dating took place, and he said that no, there's little chance that could be wrong. The same goes for Tim Joel, who is head of the Arizona lab, who's head of the who's doing. I'm not sure whether it's head. I think it might have been head of the lab.
Doug Donahue.
They can't see any problem. There's nobody that in any of the other labs thought that there was a problem. Nobody in the peer review process thought there was any problem. The analysis of the dating has been confirmed by somebody else using Bayesian analysis of all this. So there's nothing for me to go on other than a few people suggesting that this thing doesn't work. But as I pointed out, there are thousands and thousands of tests being done on an annual basis. If there was a problem, it probably would be in radiocarbon, the journal of the industry, or perhaps even in Nature. So I personally haven't got anything to go on because there are so many people telling me that no, it's perfectly okay.
Okay, so.
If Bob Rucker thinks you're probably going to mention the chi-squared bit.
I haven't gotten there yet. Yeah, that's my 3. Yeah.
So we'll go with that one then.
Well, okay, so no, I do want to give a counter here. So in the first place, though, this is why I did really hard work to identify. So you're absolutely right. that's not a peer review. Not all of these sources are peer review, but they are interviewing qualified secular carbon-14 scientists. I'm not just quote mining. That's why I got like 9 different quotes. I'm trying to mention the context of what's going on. Is it an interview? Is it a study? I gave quotes that are talking about it in general. I gave quotes that are talking about it from a archaeologist perspective, and I gave quotes from experts that are talking about with regard to the shroud itself. So I'm raising questions, but I think they're valid ones, because I didn't quote any pro-shroud people at all here, and I've done my best to give the context. I gave sort of the general sources of where I'm getting this. One of those sources that I gave was peer reviewed. Remember the 2004 paper. I think that it's worthy of questioning and looking into it. It isn't the case that all the scientific community and carbon-14 experts unanimously said, yeah, this is great, this will work, this is foolproof, and that sort of thing. I think I've provided like 9 or 11 quotes there. I didn't even read all of them. But secondly, in terms of all the proposals, that's not true at all. And I've got quotes here. I wasn't planning, because you didn't bring up neutron flux at all, but just generalizing from this, it's not true. They used the same standard in all 3 of the labs. How do I know this? Because Harry Gov himself tells me. So and I was doing this in the context of, neutron flux. So if there was neutrons, right, there are certain contaminants that could become bound to the linen. It doesn't matter what pretreatment you do, you're not going to get rid of that carbon-14 contamination. Michael Tite, Edward Hall, this is from when they did their announcement back in 1988 at the British Museum. They were reporting to giving quotes to some reporters. They said this, quote unquote, "It is certainly possible if someone gave the shroud a large dose of neutrons, for example, to produce carbon-14 in the linen cloth, it would thereby give a false date." Dr. Robert Hedges, he was one of the carbon-14 scientists that was involved in the 1988 dating, and he admits that, look, if there is a sufficient level of neutrons, and he says not nearly as much as others have supposed. So what he's referring to there is Thomas Phillips. He wrote a peer-reviewed journal in the journal Nature, the same one that you have the carbon-14 results, and he was saying that the results are not he was basically defending that, look, the shroud could have been irradiated by a neutron flux, and that would invalidate all of the scientific results. Tom Phillips is at Harvard University, the high energy labs there. And Dr. Robert Hedges, one of the carbon-14 scientists himself that did the dating, backs him up and says, yeah, look, a sufficient level of neutrons, but it's not as much as Phillips suggested it would be. It would only have to be an increase of 18%. This would completely invalidate the carbon-14 events that they got. And he goes on to say, look, this neutron flux idea was known about as a possible contaminant by all the participating labs, but measures to mitigate such a contaminant were ultimately dismissed. They didn't take the proper procedures to address this type of contaminant or other enhanced forms like carbon monoxide that John Jackson goes for. It's also, there's been scientific experiments that it is known that various hypotheses can get the date from the 1st century to the medieval lab. For example, the Isothrace radiocarbon lab in Toronto conducted tests. And they did extensive, not just the standard pretreatment, which is what the 88 labs did. They did extensive pretreatment processes. And they found that there were certain contaminants that once they had become bound to the linen, over the centuries, the carbon-14 would become bound to the linen, and especially if it was in a fire, like the 1532 fire, that accelerates this binding process. It doesn't matter what you do, you're not going to be able to get rid of that, even with extensive pre-treatment cleaning processes. I think in terms of that on general, I don't have to argue for a neutron flux. I can just say I don't know, but here's a possibility. It could be carbon monoxide, could be some form of contamination or something like that. But I just wanted to establish, look, this is plausible, and the carbon-14 scientists themselves are admitting, look, we all use the same standard. I had a quote of Gov saying that they all use the same technique, but I can't find it in my notes. So, I want to get into my three things, but just, do you have any, I'll let you have the last word if you have any comebacks on this in general thing,
In general, I feel like I'm trying to defend the fact that the Earth is round. Somebody thinks it's flat. The weight of the scientific establishment is suggesting that there isn't a problem in this particular area. What you've got to do, fine. Let's see these articles in Radiocarbon, peer-reviewed in the specialist magazines on it. I'd love to see it.
Yeah, I'll give you references.
But the main issue that constantly gets avoided here is that it is not a question of whether or not you can trust the C14 data. You have got to get the C14 data down to exactly AD30. Exactly. So in the case of the neutron flux, it's possible to have a date that's future of where we are now, depending on how much we're talking about. So it doesn't matter what the type of pollution is. It has got to be able to get from 1350 to 30, not from 1350 to 720 or 430 or any number, but exactly, or within the environs of AD30, and you can't get that.
Okay. I agree.
It's only part. It's not just a case of trying to muddy the water or whatever. Just to say the whole thing just doesn't work. It's still, as we can see from the tests, they're consistent, and therefore you've got to say, okay, well, they're not coming out with random results; they're coming out with specific results, and whether or not it's for some strange reason they've come out with a result that agrees totally with what the information they have from history, and surely, and in reality, there is some kind of strange device that's going to get you exactly to AD30. I mean, that is what Bob Rucker is suggesting. Mm-hmm. You see, he's saying that, he can get you exactly to AD30.
And I'll just say before moving on to my final part, so my three arguments against specifically the carbon dating that was done in 1988 for the Shroud. Alan's absolutely correct that nothing, it's me sort of poo-pooing on the carbon-14 and raising these doubts. That doesn't establish my case that the Shroud goes back to 30 AD. Now, I'm not trying to do that here. Remember, in this case, this is why I'm adamant that it's Alan making the claim. I'm just saying that we can't know it's medieval. It may very well be medieval, but I'm trying to attack we can't know that it's medieval based on the evidences he's giving us. In round two, the shoe's going to be on the other foot. There, I'm going to be trying to make a claim and see if I can push this thing back to the 6th century and, gosh darn it, even to Jesus in 30 AD or 33 AD, whatever you believe. But that's not, I don't have to do that here. So I just wanted to make that clear. The Shroud could indeed be medieval, but the main point I want to get across is we can't know that. The evidences presented are insufficient for us to know that it's medieval and make a claim. So with that, okay, funny. How do you defeat this carbon-14 evidence itself? Then let's get specific. So here's my first reason, and each of these reasons are sufficient in and of themselves, I think, to have no confidence in the reliability of the carbon-14 in terms of it reflecting the actual calendar age, whatever that actual age might be. And Alan admits, look, they only took one sample. And here, straight out of the gate, I have to apologize to the audience and to Harry Gov and to Alan, because the way I presented it in part one was sort of misrepresenting. I sort of made it sound like, oh, it's all Harry Gov's fault that they went from 7 labs down to 3, and the 3 different sample location areas down to just the 1. And Alan is absolutely right that wasn't Harry Gov's decision. As we'll see in a moment, he was outraged about this, and this is what's going to help my case, establish my argument here, from a letter that we have from him. So yeah, I do apologize on that front. Just understand, I was never trying to misrepresent. I was reading all of the background about Harry Gov, so that kind of got me in a bad mood against him, and I do blame him indirectly, and here's my reason why. Because when he was trying to get rid of Stirp, he threatened to quit over the location of a meeting being held in Turin versus Rome with the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, because he felt Turin was in the pocket of Stirp. He threatened to quit for just the location of a meeting. He should have done the same here. He should have said, look, my scientific integrity says I won't do this. I'm not going to date just one sample. That's not going to produce credible scientific results. So I want more than one sample. So this is, I indirectly blame Harry Gov, and I think that's what was going through my mind, but the way I presented it was absolutely wrong, because it sounded like it was his idea, his master plan, and I do apologize for that. But anyways, so everyone admits that there was this single sample. Okay, so what? Does that prove that the carbon-14 is unreliable? Well, here's a quote from William Meacham, and he was at the 1986, he was talking about this, and he says, look, no responsible radiocarbon scientist would claim that it was proven that all contaminants had been removed and that the dating range produced for a single sample was without doubt its actual calendar age. Okay, great. Well, he's an archaeologist. He's not a carbon-14 scientist, and plus he is a pro-Shroud guy. Harry Gov hated him when he was making this. Okay, let me quote Gov himself. So here's Gov's quotes. So he says, with regards to the one sample contamination problem, first of all, the piece that was removed from the shroud was divided among the 3 labs and came from one specific spot only. If there were some reason why the carbon-14 content in that piece were contaminated, it's inaccurate. All of the labs used the same cleaning technique. So this is what I was looking for before. They didn't use different techniques. They used the same cleaning technique according to Gov, which did not account for various embedded or chemically bounded and or enhanced forms of contamination. And if there was some kind of contaminant not taken care of, then it would give the same answer to all 3 labs, and all 3 would be wrong. Going on to the single sample issue. So this is coming from his letter. He's upset that this change of procedure has taken place. So this is the context of where I'm getting this quote. So he's saying, look, it would be irresponsible of us not to mention that the modification in the procedure proposed here may well lead to absolute failure. The new procedure suggested is bound, where 7 labs down to 3 and 3 locations down to 1, is bound to produce a dating result that will be questioned in strictly scientific terms by many scientists around the world, who will be very skeptical of the arbitrarily small statistical basis for our testing, i.e. the one sample. The use of a single sample is ill-advised, as it will not generate a reliable date, but will rather give rise to world controversy. So this is, I'm quoting Harry Gov here. I'm not quoting him out of context. If I am, hopefully Alan will correct that a bit. Now, I was going to move on to the sample being non-representative, but do you want to butt in on the single sample issue maybe now? And
no, obviously, what Gov was trying to argue the case that they really had to have more sample size and agree with the protocol that they had set up. So he was trying to support that, the rationale for that, because you know that Gov was absolutely certain that the results of those tests were accurate. So he was there and the Arizona one, and he said, yeah, that's it. They're spot on. So the question, again, I keep saying the question of whether or not there is any contamination. You know that Timothy Joe, professor at Arizona, had a piece of the area of the cloth that was tested left over, and he did tests on it back in 2010 to see whether or not it was representative of the rest of the cloth, and whether or not there was pollution, as in cotton or dyes, etc. And it didn't come up with anything. So I see that what's occurring here is to try to make a case that against those scientists' view that carbon-14 doesn't work, and there isn't any doubt that under certain circumstances you're going to get wrong results with carbon-14 if you've got some kind of pollution. I keep saying the same thing over again, but it doesn't get you to AD 30. And we also have the agreement with the historic date. So on a probability, there's no such thing as proof, as you know, within science. Yeah. We're not talking about that. We're talking about probabilities. So with regards to the C14 tests, I think we can be fairly happy with what we have. And as you know, Professor Ramsey also thinks that, having looked at the tests and having done tests with carbon monoxide to see if that could affect the C14 results of the type of pollution, I think couldn't find anything at all that would do it. The same occurred with the sheen produced by bacteria. Couldn't find anything on that either. So all of these things that they looked at, they can't find anything. So it's kind of like, okay, we can say that, but we don't have enough to go on to suggest that is the case. Yeah. No, I think the scientists would love to have another carbon-14 test. Yeah. The magnitude better than they used to be. They don't even need chunks anymore. They can have individual threads or even parts of an individual thread. So they'd love to have another go. No doubt at all. I'm sure what they want is more than one.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's without question. Yeah. Now I will back up Alan here, because I don't want to create the false impression that carbon-14 is just garbage in general. It's totally useless. Of course not. It is in general a great tool to use, but it should never be the sole arbiter, and you should understand the problems about it.
Can I ask you a question here?
Sure.
If the carbon-14 test had come out with 1st century date, would you be questioning the fact that only one piece of cloth would... Yeah,
well, I do. I remember I mentioned those carbon-14 dates that dated it to 30 AD, like you want, or 70 AD. I don't accept those.
Okay. Hopefully you're not going to go into that. There were no other carbon-14 tests that were done. There was a talk that a lab in California had done it. It was a lie, basically.
Okay. Okay. Well, yeah. I will admit I'm trusting people that I know that have, you saw the video, Gary Habermas, right? Gary's told me about that. So
there was only one lab that could have done it. The guy that was the head of the lab said he didn't do it, and the lab wasn't capable. Well,
okay.
the lab couldn't have done they couldn't have done the test with the amount of material that they had available. So it's just not true.
The thread. Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to stand corrected on that then, because I that isn't something that I look too hardcore into. I admitted to you and Tyler and them that, I'm sort of taking Gary's word for it. He knew the researchers that claimed that, so I was going by it as sort of not as a proof of anything, but just sort of a tactic to go, well, don't be so hasty with the carbon-14 because look at this. So yeah, I'm happy to stand corrected if you're saying that it's actually not true, because I learned the hard way. I remember the Gospel of Mark thing. So trusting someone is never always the best way to be. But going back to the actual 1988, this is the topic of the debate, and I'll just say, so I'm not trying to be unfair and say carbon-14 is totally garbage, but there are issues in general about the reliability and contaminants. There's always a question. It's never a slam dunk, and I've quoted extensively from secular carbon-14 scientists, secular archaeologists, including people that were involved in the carbon-14 themselves. So I guess Harry Gov is I don't know how to say it. He's lying here for a certain purpose. Then when he says that it will not generate a reliable date, you have to but he didn't mean it. That's not really true. I'm skeptical if he's proven to be like a liar that lies for his own ends. How do I know I can trust when he says, "Oh, I'm confident"? It's a slam dunk case. Certainly, Christopher Ramsey believes it's reliable, believes that the dates were correct, but he would not go as far as Harry Gov. He denies that it's a emphatic slam dunk case. He does admit that, as Gov said, they didn't test for enhanced types of contamination. This is why Ramsey is open to the carbon monoxide contamination hypothesis. And you did get into the location being non-representative. So,
I've got to. This wasn't the only thing where I commented on contamination, and if there is a type of contamination that cannot be removed by cleaning, then yes, there would be distortion of the C14. So fine, yeah. So.
And you understand there. This is.
We've got any evidence of this particular pollution that's supposedly there. But as I say, you keep coming back to the problem. It doesn't even matter what the pollution would possibly be.
Yeah.
All you're going to do is get a different date from the one that came out, but it isn't going to be 1830.
Yeah. Well, that's what the experts are saying. This is why there's this sort of hesitancy, because the shroud's provenance isn't totally known, and there is scientific evidence proving that it's not there is some kind of contamination or something. I don't agree with Barry that it's an invisible reweave, but he's provided those peer-reviewed papers by Ray Rogers. I suggest you check them out, and if Alan has counter sources, check those out as well, because I think that hypothesis is improbable. But apart from a patch, there are other ways that a portion of a cloth can be non-representational to the rest of the cloth. So, Alan hinted upon the fact that there's cotton fibers found, and Barry mentioned that as well. So he denies that. Okay. Well, what about the blue quad mosaic image? So this is, I think it's in part 2 podcast. It's the source called Weighing All the Evidence, page 3, if I'm remembering properly. That this was a multispectral device was used, and they showed that the image where the reflecting the chemical composition of the surface of the shroud in the area where the sample was taken from, it's colored blue. It's very different. You can see the picture right there. It's different from the rest of the cloth. Additionally, ultraviolet fluorescent images were taken by Dr. Vern Miller, and it shows that this region is visibly darker in that spot where they took the sample compared to the rest of the cloth. Also, Dr. Alan Adler, on a chemical level, has done various things, tests, and discovered there's a water stain in the area, and there's starch or salt as well. So here's what he says, based on a chemical analysis as opposed to spectral. Quote unquote, there's far more salt in the radiocarbon sample fibers than the water stains on the rest of the shroud. That is because in the water stains, the water hit and the soluble salts started diffusing out into the cloth. They diffuse without limit until they stop diffusing. But if you look at where the sample, the carbon-14 sample was taken, it is quote-unquote bounded. It is a bounded water stain. So that means that all the soluble materials diffuse until they hit the edge, and then they concentrate there in the edges. So the radiocarbon fibers have a different chemical composition from the non-image fibers of the body of the cloth. Therefore, you have the right to raise the question, is this a representative sample? It doesn't matter whether you think you have an answer to that or not. It is not a representative sample. So that's Alan Adler's quote. So yeah, I just wanted to raise, and this is among other, wax, tallow, that's another major contaminant that Harry Gov himself said, yeah, I looked into the microscope, it seems to be there is this contamination on that level. As to whether that can explain away the carbon-14 results or whatever, or just play a contributing factor perhaps in the contamination. Yeah, like I said, I have quotes from Gov himself admitting that he's seen certain contaminants in this area. So it's just not true that it was pristine, totally clean, and they were able to remove everything, and it was a pure dating result. There's a lot of unknowns with the Shroud's history, and there are knowns. I think there are some knowns that suggest this sample is not representative. There's an area of doubt here on that. Now, Alan, do you want me to move on to Rutgers or let you respond to the non-rep? Because I know you already sort of said stuff.
No, John Jackson said that the banding that goes through the cloth showed that the and this is to do with whether or not any new pieces have been added. That shows that couldn't possibly have occurred, but of course you don't think that's a viable thing in any event. Close-ups of the actual particular area taken don't seem to suggest. It seems to suggest that the material is similar to other parts of the cloth and not representative of other parts as well. But with all of these things, I'm coming back. Well, the amount of pro-Shroud people bleating on about this has gone on for decades, right? And obviously, all of this is just to try to rubbish the C14 date, because they don't like the answer that it gives. Not because they actually think that there is a major problem. They all disagree with each other as to why it's a problem.
Sure, and that's fine. Right?
So there's an agenda going on here.
But there's scientific data that needs to be accounted for, right? It's the results or scientific findings don't care about the person's bias or whatever. So there are still these findings that suggest, look, there's something going on here, whatever it is. Me and Barry may quibble about, well, is it a neutron flux, or is it an invisible reweave, or is it John Jackson carbon monoxide, or whatever? Is it a biocontamination layer? That's fine. That's what science is about. We're allowed to disagree. We don't have to have one. We're not on a team. Like
but you're not scientists. This is the thing. Shouldn't it be
true? I'm not.
Radiocarbon scientists being the ones that are actually questioning all of these things. I mean, it's all very well. People coming up with ideas in areas they're not particularly experts in. in order to come up with cunning plans, and there is amazingly cunning ideas. As you're about to mention one with Bob Rucker, there's amazingly clever ideas as to why things aren't correct. And wouldn't you believe it? The thing I want to believe the most, that's the one that these things all point to. Well, that science doesn't work like that. So fine, if you can show me the articles in radiocarbon that show that it's not that there's a problem with the C14 dating, I'm more than happy to have a look at those.
Yeah, and here it's with the neutron flux, right? Like, so Thomas Phillips, he's a carbon-14 expert. So the article is called "Shroud Irradiated with Neutrons." This came out in 1989, months after the same thing. It came out in Nature. That's the journal that Gov's results came out in, right? Michael Tite and all the carbon-14 scientists. Number 337, page 594.
But hang on, just a kind of. We have agreed that certain types of pollution will have an effect, and yes, neutrons, by their very nature, are going to affect the nitrogen to C14 movement, aren't they? So yeah, that isn't the issue, though, is it?
You're talking about the
question is, you could say that. So where are these neutrons coming from then?
Yeah, magic. that's my. Well, I'm a Christian. I'm not. I believe in the supernatural, but yeah. Okay, but still, it's. I guess what I was trying to get at is, look, at the end of the day, we have credible scientific results. I mean, the same people that you're saying here are just biased. Are this largely the same ones that were involved in STIRP, but they can still have credible findings, and an instrument doesn't care about your religious bias. So I just want to be careful that we don't just dismiss everything people say because they're a Christian, or because it's even if it's not peer reviewed. I wouldn't say you just ignore that. Obviously, peer review is by far way better, but peer review is not the be all and end all. Obviously, we have peer reviewed journals that contradict each other that come out, right? So be mindful of that, but don't dismiss these results. I don't think it's made up.
No, but you can be gullible, and that's it's the. If you look at Giulio Fanti or Bob Rucker or Rogers, they're all coming up with cunning plans to get the data to say what they want.
Sure.
And by missing out the most important information, they can present something that looks credible, but if you look a bit closer, it isn't.
Yeah.
So, if you're, this is pseudoscience, and stuff that Barry was talking about last week. Some of these guys are going out of their way to produce false information. They're not even. I know what you're saying about the instruments, but if you point, it's what you do with the instruments that's important.
Okay, so the conclusion.
If you reference that, but no doubt we're going to talk about that next time. But so. I mean, with this, I guess onto Rucker, perhaps we might be able to bring this to an end, because...
Yeah, but I just want to say, though, like, absolutely, Alan's correct, right? Like, when it comes to interpretations of the data and conclusions, people can come up with ingenious ideas, and you got to watch out for that, right? That's why it's good to see both sides, and I hope that's kind of the point of having Alan on here to do this discussion. It's not just one-sided. We can get pro and con. We've both provided sources for people to look at. So as Barry said, yeah, you go out and decide, right? Like not everyone on the skeptical side has to agree with each other. Not everyone on the pro side. has to agree with each other. Go out and, to the best of your ability, see what you can find by looking at the literature, understand the difference between a peer review and non-peer reviewed work, understand the bias of where these people are coming from on both sides. But yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, you are responsible for what you believe. You try your best to come to what you think is true, as best you can. So yeah, going on to Rucker's statistical analysis. So this is another, basically Rob Rucker, he's not the only one, right? You understand, so I know you referenced the 1994 chi-square analysis, I think it was, where he, what was his name, Chris, anyways, he backed up the 1989 published results from the 88 testing. But the problem is, after the fact, we got more data. We found out they didn't just take 12 measurements, they took a total of 16, and they averaged out the most troublesome aspects, because when you do a chi-square analysis, you need to you need to come up with 2 sigma level of difference, which is equivalent to a 95% degree of certainty. This is an international secular standard, according to my understanding. This is what you need to get in order to claim your results are reliable. The problem is, when you factor in all of the data, unfudged, so to speak, you actually get close to 3 sigma, and this means we have less than a 95% degree of confidence in these results. That, I mean, when you factor into the fact that, look, there's a gap of 255-year range for the samples taken in less than 5 centimeters from each other on the same cloth. This is problematic, and it's suggestive. Rutgers calculated it out, and there's a 98.6% chance that there's systematic bias going on. The carbon-14 scientists assumed, without justification, they assumed, oh, well, the reason for these outliers is it's measurement error. But given all the data, Rucker and others, so it's not just Rucker, I'm including articles by Remy Van Helst, who's done similar work, Professor Beeney of the University of Geneva, statistician Brian J. Walsh has done his own analysis on the statistical end. So yeah, this isn't just Rucker's, he's Johnny come lately when it comes to these statistical type arguments. And they all suggest that, look, there's some kind of systematic bias going on. We might not know what that is. Rucker has his idea that it's a neutron flux, and he's tried to come up with his way, as Alan says, to get it back to 30 AD. Forget that. At minimally, we know that there's some kind of systematic bias going on, and this causes me to not have any confidence in the carbon-14 results, at least based on what we have right now. If there's another dating result, maybe that'll increase if it gives the same results or something. But yeah, that's my take. Over to you, Alan.
Right, well, with regards to the, okay, I'm not an expert, so I can't actually comment on the chi-square test. All I can say is, so have they published that work?
No. So no, with regard to Rucker, there might be something. I'll check the others.
What I would say is that I mean, if we're not getting feedback from the people that are closest to the actual data itself, I believe this is only related to the Arizona lab, and not specifically to the other 2 labs. From what other comments have been made on this, whatever happens, you're still going to be getting a medieval date with this. Bob Rucker wants to use this to support his own cunning ideas on how you can get C14 testing back to AD 30.
Right.
So he wants it to be partially wrong. That's the way he's looking at it. So from my point of view, all I etc., actually depend on the best experts out there in the planet, because I am not an expert on all of these things. So it's great that you come up with all lots of buts, but so do flat Earth enthusiasts.
Yeah, but that's why you got to look at their.
What they're doing is they're just ignoring what the established ideas are, and this is what I want to believe. This is the way I'm looking at the information, and I can prove positively from that the Earth is flat. Well, yeah. So step one, where they were going wrong, was to deny the scientific establishment's view. So it's the first thing you should do, is to actually, okay, they can be wrong, but they know an awful lot more than we do. So isn't it strange that we only get to hear about their views when the results of the establishment views is contrary to what they want to believe, and that's exactly the same with the Shroud. What can I say?
That's not fair, right?
What evidence we have is pointing in the wrong direction. Let's come up with some new evidence then. I mean, that's people listening to this. This is what they're going to be thinking.
Yeah, but that's what they're doing, right? Like it's entirely fair to question the scientific establishment. Obviously, I'm trying to remember if it's Kuhn or Karl Popper that talks about the scientific paradigms and that sort of thing, and how you have major shifts and that kind of thing. But obviously, the scientific consensus is there for a reason. It should never be easily overturned. But at the same time, you should be open to the fact that it can be overturned. And these guys are presenting good scientific data and arguments worthy of consideration, at least. There are enough secular establishment scientists backing up that, look, not everything they're saying is rubbish. No, this is part of the reason, and I know Jim's not a statistician, but still, you could hardly accuse him of being biased. He agrees with you that it'll still be medieval, even if it's in the 1100s to somewhere in the 1400s, if we take the 16 things, right? So by no means am I saying, well, there you go, it's proof that Rucker's right and it goes back to 30 AD. We can't do that. But based on what we know, we shouldn't have confidence in the results that's going out, and this is why you've got to evaluate the claims. Is this rubbish like a flat earther's arguments, or is there something here?
Then you've got to take it to peer reviewed. There's an example, I haven't actually mentioned it, where Ray Rogers had a peer-reviewed paper published in a very good Some Chemical Actor, and there's another article rubbishing everything that he said and saying it's pseudoscience, and that's been published in the same journal. Now, you can get. So you can attack somebody else's work and get it published. So why don't these guys do that then? Fine, get it published.
Right. They do. They do, right? And the same. Remember Thomas Phillips in Nature magazine a few months after contradicting the 1988 results. So I think it's good to get it into peer review. This is something we should always strive for and prefer. But just because something's not...
I would say the best in the actual... it should be Nature that this comes into, because they're the ones that publish the data to start with. But
Rob Rucker, though, like for example, with it, he's taking the results that they are giving. He's not disputing their measurements or anything, and he's applying a simple chi-square analysis. Right? Anthony 6'6", he's got his PhD in math. He says, look, this thing is a simple calculation to do. So I find it there's no way Rucker would, and Jim checked it out So you trust them, right?
So the query would be, if this is such a straightforward calculation, and again, I'm not an expert here, but if this is a straightforward calculation, and if the data has gone through peer review, it wasn't just the peer review within the magazine, of course. Had it reviewed the British Museum had it reviewed prior to publishing it. So there were a number of things that had already occurred, and somehow this wasn't spotted, and yet, it's out there, and yet nobody's talking about it. Why am I not hearing about it from any radiocarbon institute lab? So I can only. I am not in a position to question these things, but I am expecting this to be robustly argued. When we talked yesterday about the Allen's Hill meteorite and NASA suggesting that they'd found large Martian organisms, or potentially, and the scientists came down on them like a ton of bricks.
Yeah.
Saying something that doesn't add up. Scientists aren't shy of coming forward, so I am expecting to see that. I'm not seeing it. I've seen quite a few.
Scientists are shy, can be shy, right? Like they need funding as well. So they're, and it's also a matter of interest. I suggest proof of aliens is a sensational topic, whereas with religion, the shroud is a very niche. How many historians? You said yourself, how many historians are going on about the shroud and stuff like that? And you said yourself, look, there's only a handful of them that even care enough to do this. I wouldn't expect to see an article by Mary Beard talking about the Shroud of Turin. She doesn't care. She's doing her own thing, right? So we're getting into motivations and speculating as to why these scientists aren't all talking about this. But the fact is, look, when you apply the same test, this is the same test the 1988 scientists did. I'm not trying to be insulting, but they did have to fudge the data in the sense that they averaged these 8 results into 4, and voila, they got the 95% degree of certainty that is required by these international standards. Once all of the data, all 8 of it came out, and you plug it into this, all of a sudden now it doesn't work. Now you're close to 3 signal levels, or less than 95%. That's got to cause you to be like, well, you know what? I'm not going to place my faith in this until I find out what was going on. There is an amount of suspiciousness there, at least. Like, why average it? Why average it at all? Just take the data that you get, all of the measurements, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Okay. Well, I can't, as I say, I can't argue the case one way or the other because I'm not qualified to do so.
Fair enough.
But you've made your case.
Yeah, I'm happy with that.
Particular thing. Do you want to mention the other parts of Bob Rucker's cunning plan, or are we leaving it there?
So you mean like the neutron flux? How he gets it? What do you mean the other part of his cunning plan?
Oh, no, the cunning plan of how the neutron flux affects the C14 to produce exactly the right movement in the data. You think you've already done that? I don't know.
Yeah, you know what? I purposely don't want to do that because I think that'll confuse. Like I'm trying. I don't know if you noticed, but like I do try to. I want to keep it focused. Look, pretend the neutron flux is all wrong. We don't even have to care. There are these. Alan's making a claim that the shroud is medieval, and he knows that there's carbon-14, and I'm raising that there are certain questions that, for me, make the evidence not convincing that we can prove the shroud is medieval. So yeah, I don't know if I want to argue for a neutron flux. Maybe we'll throw it in a future thing. But I think it'll confuse the audience if I try to do that. So let's stick to what's here in round 1.
Okay, well, I think we can wrap up then, can't we?
Yeah, I think it was a great show. I mean, thank you once again, Alan, for doing this. I mean, my goodness, it's quite over 3 hours. Beautiful. So an hour and a half each. And we're just getting started, guys. We still got more shows coming up.
Or it's 3.5 hours. No, I don't know.
Well, since I started recording, 3 hours 10 minutes. So.
Oh, okay, fine.
So yeah, no, like I said, I appreciate you coming on. I had a great time. I love the civility in this convo. We're getting down to the substantial issues and trying our best to tackle the topic. So, hopefully you enjoyed your time on the show.
Absolutely, except for the length.
Yeah, I'll cut it down next time. Like, oh my gosh, I had 50 pages of notes prepared. I did like a fraction of it. So yeah, there's a lot to know on the Shroud, guys.
Right. Yes. That's. Yes. And we haven't even started yet, Dal.
I know. Oh, man. See, this is why I need a podcast of like 20 parts. Just, but yeah, no. As I said, thank you so much for being on the show, Alan. When were you thinking for round 2? Like, what's your schedule like? Did you need some?
I think I'm okay. Probably need a couple of weeks.
Yeah, same here. No, I wouldn't be able to do it next week. So.
Since we've got 2 programs here, haven't we? There's no way this one's going to work in 2, though.
Yeah, but David's going to be posting it succinctly. He'll post this up on Sunday, and then the next day this will be up. So it'll be done in.
You might delete a half an hour of it.
Hopefully, yeah. I trust him with all that stuff. He gets rid of all the garbage that I say. So, perfect. So yeah, we'll look in a couple weeks. I'll email you for those interested. So finally, pressure's off Alan. Now it's going to be on me. I'm going to have the burden of proof. We're going to be talking about again, it's related to dating. So I'm going to be talking about the art history and coins argument, which place it in the 5th or 6th century AD, the Sudarium of Oviedo, which I think is the strongest evidence placing it prior to the medieval period in the 6th century or 5th century AD. And then also sort of a fluff, like I wanted to put in a fluff argument for Alan, sort of comparable to how I see his medallion argument. So that's the 3 physical tests. Barry mentioned that and gave a critique. He said there's only 2. There's 3 there, but also the chemical test that Ray Rogers did comparing the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's sort of that's going to be easy for Alan. That's sort of not a lot of studies needed. Then we're going to get into, okay, can I establish that it does go back to the historical Jesus? And Alan's got a bunch of historical inaccuracies saying it can't be Jesus or can't be a 1st century Jew. So hopefully he'll email me, which specific ones he intends to present, and I can come up with a counter. So yeah, thank you so much for listening and putting up with this long podcast. Have a great week, everyone, and say goodbye, Alan.
Goodbye, Alan.
All right, goodbye. Goodbye, Dale. Take care.